For years, Mark and Lily lived what seemed like a perfect life. Mark was a successful lawyer, known for his sharp mind and dedication to his career. He worked long hours, often staying late at the office or attending high-profile meetings, all in the name of providing a better life for his family. Lily, his wife, was a loving, devoted mother and a school teacher who adored her children and the life she had built with Mark. They had two beautiful kids, Ella, a bright and curious 7-year-old, and Luke, a playful 5-year-old boy who loved soccer and video games. Their home was everything they had dreamed of, spacious, warm, and filled with laughter. It was a house filled with family photos, treasured memories, and the kind of peace that made it feel like the world outside didn't matter. Mark and Lily had been married for 10 years, and from the outside they were the picture of success. Neighbors often admired their idyllic family, and friends envied their seemingly perfect relationship. But behind closed doors, things were starting to unravel. Mark's demanding job, which had initially been the source of their financial success, had become a wedge between them. Long hours at the office meant he missed family dinners, anniversaries, and even school events. The distance between them grew, and though they had once shared a deep emotional connection, it began to fade. Mark justified his absence, promising Lily that things would improve soon, but those promises became hollow as time went on. Lily, feeling increasingly alone in the marriage, sought comfort in the one person she felt she could trust: Jason. Jason had been her close friend since high school, someone who had been there for her through thick and thin. He had a magnetic personality, charming, witty, and always able to make her laugh. He was a few years older than Lily, but their bond had never faded. Over the years, Jason had become a regular part of their lives, always showing up when they needed him, whether it was for a quick favor or simply to offer some friendly advice. At first, their relationship remained strictly platonic. Mark had no reason to suspect anything more was going on. He knew Jason was just a supportive friend, someone who was reliable and kind. But as the months passed, Lily found herself spending more time with Jason, talking to him late into the night about her frustrations, her fears, and her dreams. She confided in him about the loneliness she felt in her marriage, about how she wished things could be different. Jason, always a good listener, offered her the comfort she hadn't been getting from Mark. He made her feel understood, validated, and important. The friendship grew deeper, and what started as innocent conversations began to evolve into something more. Jason was there for Lily in ways Mark no longer was. He showed up when she needed someone to talk to, when she felt invisible in her own home. Over time, those late-night conversations turned into secret meetings, coffee dates, walks in the park, and quiet dinners that were just for the two of them. What began as emotional support soon turned physical, though Lily never intended it to happen. She felt conflicted, torn between the love she still had for Mark and the undeniable attraction she had developed for Jason. She told herself it was a one-time mistake, that it was just a moment of weakness. But as time went on, it became clear that the emotional affair was no longer just about seeking comfort. It was about something deeper, something she couldn't ignore. Mark, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the growing distance between him and Lily. His focus was on his career, and he trusted that their family would stay intact no matter what. But little did he know, the foundation of their relationship was slowly crumbling beneath him. All because of a friendship that had turned into a dangerous secret. It was a typical evening when everything changed for Mark. After another long day at the office, he decided to come home earlier than usual, eager to spend some time with his family. The thought of dinner and laughter around the table filled him with relief, a rare moment of peace amidst his hectic schedule. He pulled into the driveway, parked his car, and entered through the back door. The house was unusually quiet. Too quiet for a family of 4. Mark called out for Lily, expecting a warm response, but there was nothing. He wandered through the house, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent rooms. The kids weren't in their rooms or playing in the living room, and Lily wasn't in the kitchen, where she usually was preparing dinner. Mark's worry deepened, and he started calling for them again. As he approached the guest room at the far end of the hallway, he heard faint voices, laughter, and the sound of shuffling. The noises stopped as quickly as they had started. His heart began to race. He felt an unsettling sense of dread wash over him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment before he opened the door slowly. What he saw next would forever change the course of his life. There, sitting together on the edge of the bed, were Lily and Jason. The air between them felt thick, charged with an unspoken tension, their faces flushed, their eyes wide as they froze in place at the sight of Mark standing in the doorway. Lily quickly pulled away from Jason, her face pale as she stammered something Mark couldn't quite make out. For a moment, Mark just stood there, his mind racing as the world around him seemed to collapse. The shock was overwhelming. His wife, the woman he had trusted for years, the mother of his children, was sitting there with his best friend. The man who had been a fixture in their home, a familiar face he had welcomed into their lives, was now the one who had shared something far more intimate with Lily than he ever could have imagined. Mark's breath caught in his chest, and the weight of the situation crashed over him in waves. Lily, looking ashamed, quickly stood up, her voice trembling as she tried to explain. But Mark wasn't listening. Her words sounded distant, almost irrelevant. All he could hear in his mind were the images of what he had just witnessed, the realization that his marriage, his family, had been betrayed in the worst possible way. The love and trust he had placed in both of them felt like a cruel joke, and a deep, searing anger began to take root inside him. Jason, still sitting on the bed, looked equally uncomfortable. He tried to speak, but Mark couldn't hear him. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. Mark's entire body felt like it was on fire with emotion. Hurt, anger, confusion, all tangled together in a storm of disbelief. How could this have happened? How had it gone so far without him noticing? Lily's voice broke through the chaos in his mind, her words a blur of apologies and explanations. She told him that it had started as something innocent, that Jason had just been a friend, someone she could confide in. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. The comfort she had found in Jason had turned into something deeper, something she hadn't planned on. It was the last thing she ever wanted to happen, but it had. Jason, meanwhile, had nothing to say. He just sat there, his face red with embarrassment. It was clear he was as much a part of the betrayal as Lily was, but there was no denying the role he had played in the destruction of Mark's world. Mark didn't know what to say. His mind was too foggy, too filled with anger and heartbreak. He couldn't believe it. His wife, the woman he had built a life with, had betrayed him in the worst possible way with the man he had called his friend. As Lily tried to approach him to offer some form of comfort or explanation, Mark backed away. He couldn't look at her, not like this. In that moment, the foundation of his life felt like it had crumbled beneath him. Everything he thought he knew, his marriage, his friendship, his family, had been shattered. Mark turned and walked out of the room, leaving Lily and Jason behind, feeling as though he was walking through a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The life he had worked so hard to build was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to fix it. In the days that followed, Mark was lost in a haze of confusion and emotional turmoil. He barely slept, his mind spinning with questions he couldn't answer. Lily, desperate to repair the damage, tried to approach him several times, but Mark refused to speak to her. Every time she tried, he pushed her away, unable to process the depth of her betrayal. It felt like a constant ache in his chest, one he couldn't escape. The pain was overwhelming, and he didn't know where to turn for comfort. All he could think about was the image of Lily and Jason together, the betrayal that cut deeper than anything he had ever experienced. But then something happened that made the situation even more complicated. One morning, weeks after the confrontation, Lily came to him with a confession that shook him to his core. She was pregnant. At first, Mark didn't know how to react. He stood there, stunned, the words barely registering. A rush of emotions hit him at once, shock, disbelief, and a growing sense of dread. He hadn't even processed everything about the affair, and now his wife was carrying a child? Lily seemed nervous but resolute. She told him she had taken a test the previous week and the results confirmed what she had feared. She was pregnant and she didn't know who the father was. Her voice trembled as she explained that given the timing, it was possible the child was Mark's, though she couldn't be sure. A wave of disbelief washed over him. Could this really be happening? Was she really pregnant with his child, or was it Jason's? And the uncertainty gnawed at him, and he could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. Mark didn't know how to react. Part of him wanted to scream, to demand answers, but another part of him felt strangely numb. His mind couldn't wrap itself around the idea that his wife had been unfaithful, and now there was a child involved, a child who might not even be his. The thought twisted his insides and he felt sick. Lily's eyes were filled with guilt and regret as she continued to talk. She told him that, though she didn't want to admit it, the affair had gone on longer than she had originally let on. She had tried to convince herself it was just a mistake, a one-time thing that she could forget, but as time went on, her feelings for Jason had deepened, and now there was a consequence neither of them had expected. She didn't know how to tell Mark, but she couldn't live with the secret anymore. Mark was silent. He couldn't even look at her. All he could think about was the idea of raising a child that might not be his, a child that had come from the very man who had destroyed his marriage. The situation was becoming more and more complicated with each passing day. His mind raced with questions. If the baby was Jason's, what did that mean for his relationship with Lily? Could he ever look at her the same way again? Could he ever trust her? The fear that gripped him was paralyzing. He didn't know what to do, how to process everything. All he wanted was to forget it all, to go back to a time when life had been simple, before all of this chaos had exploded in their faces. But he couldn't turn back. The truth was out, and he had to face it, no matter how painful. The uncertainty lingered in the air, thick and heavy. Mark knew he had a decision to make, one that would affect the rest of his life. He had to decide whether to stay in the marriage, to raise a child that might not be his, or to walk away from everything he had ever known. He didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear: the path ahead would be anything but easy. As the weeks passed, the tension in the household only deepened. Mark couldn't escape the thoughts that consumed him. Every time he looked at Lily, the weight of her betrayal hovered between them. He knew she was trying to rebuild the trust that had been shattered, but he couldn't shake the image of her and Jason together, laughing and sharing moments that should have been his. The love he had once felt for her was now tainted, replaced by a suffocating feeling of anger and doubt. But the baby, he couldn't forget about the baby. Even if he wanted to, he couldn't. A child was on the way, and it wasn't something he could ignore. Lily, too, was caught in the throes of her own emotional storm. She had never meant for any of this to happen. She had been desperate for attention, for validation, and in her vulnerability she had made a catastrophic mistake. The affair with Jason had been a moment of weakness, a blurring of lines that she couldn't undo. Now, not only was her marriage in tatters, but she was carrying a child whose father she wasn't even sure of. Every time she looked at Mark, she saw the pain in his eyes, and it cut her deeper than she cared to admit. She wanted so badly to fix it, to make everything right, but she didn't know how. The atmosphere in the house was tense. Mark withdrew further into himself, becoming more distant. He focused on work, trying to drown out the growing chaos inside him. Lily, desperate to find some semblance of normalcy, tried to continue her daily routines, but everything felt forced. Their children, who had once been the joy of their lives, now seemed like a reminder of what was slipping through their fingers. Ella and Luke could feel the change, though they didn't understand it. Their playful laughter was quieter, their smiles smaller, as if they too sensed the fracture in their family. One evening, when Mark returned home earlier than usual, he found Lily sitting alone in the living room, staring out the window. Her eyes were distant and her face was drawn with exhaustion. It was a rare moment of peace, a silence that hung heavily in the air. Mark stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of what to do. He had been avoiding her, avoiding this moment, but it was inevitable. The conversation needed to happen, even if neither of them knew how to begin. Lily looked up as he entered the room, her eyes immediately filling with tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Mark stood there, his heart heavy, unable to reach out to her. He had been trying to reconcile his feelings, to figure out if he could ever forgive her. But the more he thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. There was a child involved now, and that made everything even more complicated. Lily finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She told him that she loved him, that she regretted everything that had happened, and that she didn't know how to fix the mess she had created. She admitted that she had been selfish, that she had let her own insecurities lead her down a path she couldn't undo. But above all, she told him that she wanted to try to rebuild their relationship, try to be the wife and mother she was meant to be. Mark didn't know how to respond. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. He was still reeling from everything he had learned, everything that had happened. The thought of forgiving her, of pretending everything could go back to how it once was, felt impossible. But then again, the thought of tearing apart their family, of walking away from the life they had built, was equally unbearable. The truth was, Mark didn't know what he wanted anymore. He didn't know if he could ever forgive her, if he could ever trust her again. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that, despite everything, there was still a part of him that loved her. And that was the part that kept him there, sitting in that room, frozen in place as the weight of their broken reality settled in. The future was uncertain. Mark had no clear answers, and neither did Lily. But they both knew one thing: their lives had been irrevocably changed, and nothing would ever be the same again. As the days turned into weeks, Mark and Lily continued to live under the shadow of their fractured relationship. The house was no longer the warm, peaceful home it once had been. Instead, it felt like a place of constant tension, where every conversation felt fragile and every silence seemed laden with unspoken words. Mark found himself withdrawing further into his own mind, caught in a battle between the love he had once felt for Lily and the overwhelming betrayal that now consumed him. The question that haunted him was whether forgiveness was even possible. Could he really look past the affair, the lies, and the looming uncertainty about the baby, or was their marriage doomed beyond repair? Lily, on the other hand, was in a constant state of regret and guilt. She had thought that the affair would be her escape from her loneliness, but instead, it had become the thing that destroyed everything. She had lost her husband's trust, her best friend's respect, and, in many ways, her own sense of self. The pregnancy only complicated matters further. The fear that the child might not be Mark's consumed her. Every time she looked at her growing belly, she was reminded of the consequences of her actions, consequences that she knew she could never undo. One afternoon, Mark came home from work early, his mind as clouded as ever. He had spent the last few days grappling with his emotions, trying to decide if he could move forward with Lily or if it was time to walk away. His thoughts were interrupted when he saw Lily sitting at the kitchen table looking at a stack of old family photos. The sight of her staring down at the pictures of their happiest moments together struck him like a punch to the gut. He remembered a time when everything had seemed so simple, when the love they shared had felt unbreakable. But now, those memories felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. Lily looked up when she saw Mark standing in the doorway. She gave him a small, nervous smile, but there was a sadness in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. She didn't say anything at first, and neither did he. They both just stood there, unsure of what to say, lost in their own thoughts. After a long silence, Lily finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She apologized again, telling him that she had made the worst mistake of her life. She begged him to give her another chance, to try to fix the pieces of their broken life. But Mark felt nothing but a deep ache in his chest as he listened. How could he forgive her? How could he ever forget the betrayal that had rocked their family to its core? For a moment it seemed like nothing would change. Mark still couldn't shake the doubt that lingered in his mind. The affair was one thing, but the pregnancy added a layer of complexity that neither of them had been prepared for. He didn't know if he could ever be sure that the child was his, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. But as he looked at Lily, sitting there with tears in her eyes, he realized something. He wasn't just angry at her, he was angry at himself too, for not seeing the cracks in their marriage, for not being there when she needed him, for letting work consume him to the point where he had failed as a husband. It was then that he understood something important. Healing would take time. There were no easy answers, no magical fixes. But maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild their relationship. It wouldn't be quick or painless, but if they both put in the effort, there was a chance. Mark knew that it wouldn't be easy to trust her again, and he couldn't guarantee that their marriage would ever be the same. But the one thing that remained was his love for her. The love that had once been enough to hold them together, even when things seemed impossible. Mark sat down at the table across from Lily, his heart heavy but willing to try. They both knew that their journey was just beginning. There were still many difficult conversations ahead, many unresolved emotions to work through, but for the first time in weeks, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe their marriage could survive this. Maybe they could find a way back to each other. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and doubts, but they were willing to take the first step together. As they sat there, quietly facing the weight of their past, they realized that while forgiveness wouldn't come easily, it was a possibility, and perhaps in the end, that was enough to give them both the chance they needed to heal. As time passed, Mark and Lily began the slow and painful process of rebuilding what had been shattered. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't perfect. There were days when the weight of the past felt too heavy to carry, when the betrayal seemed impossible to forgive. But they both knew that walking away would only leave them with more unanswered questions and regrets. They decided to give their relationship a chance, not because they were certain it would work, but because they owed it to themselves and to their children to at least try. Lily's pregnancy progressed, and with it the tension between her and Mark remained. It was difficult to be excited about the baby, knowing that the child might not even be his. Mark continued to struggle with the uncertainty, but as the weeks went by, something inside him began to shift. He started attending therapy not just for the marriage but for himself. He realized that to move forward he needed to understand his own emotions, to work through the anger and the hurt. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Lily too sought help. She knew that she needed to understand why she had let herself fall into the affair, why she had betrayed the man she once loved. Through therapy, she began to confront her own insecurities and fears. She learned that her need for validation had come from a deep place of loneliness, and though it didn't excuse her actions, it helped her understand the breakdown in their relationship. Mark and Lily both attended couples therapy, slowly learning how to communicate again, how to rebuild the trust that had been lost. By the time the baby arrived, Mark had made the decision to raise the child as his own, regardless of the biological father. He knew that the child didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of their mess. They both agreed to take things one day at a time, focusing on healing and being present for their children. Though their marriage was far from perfect, there was a renewed sense of commitment to each other and to their family. Years later, they would look back on this chapter of their lives as the most difficult period they had ever faced, but it was also a turning point. It taught them the importance of trust, communication, and the need to always be present in the relationship. Though they couldn't undo the past, they had learned from it, and in the end that was what mattered most. They had chosen to fight for their family, and in doing so they had found a new strength. Together.